What's up everyone, this is Ryan Eckert with Peak Endurance Solutions, and in this video I'm going to be talking about ways in which you can measure aerobic fitness. What's going on everyone? Diving right in this particular video I'm going to be discussing ways in which you can assess and measure and kind of track over time aerobic fitness or aerobic durability, or the ability to kind of sustain low intensity efforts or sub-threshold efforts for long periods of time. Especially in endurance sport, we like to kind of focus on some key metrics related to like VO2 max, or what's really big with runners and particularly cyclists is threshold power or functional threshold power. And then aerobic efficiency or muscular efficiency or mechanical efficiency is another really big thing that we like to focus on. Especially in the research literature, we tend to see that VO2 max, threshold, and then mechanical efficiency are three of the big factors that are associated with improved endurance performance. So if you improve your VO2 max, if you improve your threshold, and if you become more efficient or economical, you tend to improve your endurance performance, whether it's in swimming, cycling, running, whatever the sport is. But another kind of fitness metric or characteristic that oftentimes doesn't get talked about quite enough, but is incredibly important, especially for endurance athletes that are competing in longer distance events. So things like half marathon, marathon, and then most of the triathlon distances like sprints, Olympics, and then especially half Ironman and full Ironman distance events. And then again, also events that are very steady state in nature. So things like half Ironmans and Ironmans, because they're so steady state and they're such long events where you're just kind of holding very steady power outputs and paces for a prolonged period of time. One factor that starts to become really, really important is your aerobic fitness. And so I use that term quite frequently, aerobic fitness, but I rarely kind of dive into what it means specifically and how you can like measure it and assess it within a workout. And another way to think of aerobic fitness is kind of your like low intensity durability. So your ability to hold like an aerobic pace. So think of like if you're using the kind of classic 5-zone model, which I tend to like to use, it'd be like those zone 1 or zone 2 efforts, or maybe even like a low zone 3 effort. So this is all very sub-threshold type of intensity, very easy intensities in fact. So like a zone 1 effort is kind of like your recovery effort, and then a zone 2 effort is your like classic all-day aerobic effort. It's the kind of effort that you might do like a long run at, or a really long endurance ride at, or a long endurance swim at. And then zone 3 would be kind of like your sub-threshold like tempo effort kind of zone. So that would be something that you might like race a half marathon at, or you might race an Olympic distance, or even like a half Ironman distance race at would be like a zone 3. So the ability to hold these sub-threshold efforts for long periods of time without breaking down or slowing down is essentially like your aerobic fitness, or your aerobic durability. And so one of the ways that we can start to look at this and we can start measuring it and tracking it over time is by looking at the relationship between heart rate and power, or heart rate and pace, depending on what sport you're participating in. So with cycling, power is usually the big metric that most people will focus on. And this doesn't really work for speed, because speed is so variable depending on the terrain, but power is something that doesn't really matter depending on the terrain or the environment. Power is power, and going uphill or down a hill, 200 watts is 200 watts. Your speed is going to be slower, but power isn't affected by those variables. And then with the run, there are power meters on the run, but they're they're a lot less common than they are on the bike. So normally pace is what we focus on. And then with swimming, normally swimming is kind of one of those sports that typically relies on a lot of like feel, and maybe you look at pace to a certain extent, but normally heart rate isn't captured, although you can do this with swimming by using heart rate and pace. But for the purpose of this video, I'm going to be using cycling and running as an example, but just know that this applies to pretty much any endurance sport that you're doing, whether it's cross-country skiing, swimming, cycling, running, ultra trail running, whatever the sport is that you're doing. This concept of like aerobic fitness and aerobic durability can be very much applicable. So like I said, one of the ways that we can begin to look at this or measure this or assess this is by looking at the relationship between heart rate and power, or heart rate and pace. And so this is one of the ways that I really like to use heart rate. So I won't dive into necessarily all the different ways in which you can use heart rate versus power versus pace, and when you should focus on what depending on the workout. But one time that I do really like to look at heart rate is on low intensity training sessions. So especially like recovery sessions and aerobic sessions. I really like to look at heart rate, and especially for like long duration aerobic sessions like bike rides that are like over 2 to 3 hours in length, long runs that are over 60 minutes. And then also for race files too. So when you actually go back and you look at race files, so like the bike leg of a half Ironman, which is what I'm going to talk about here, or like the run leg of an Ironman. So looking at the relationship between heart rate and your pace and heart rate and your power can give you a lot of insights into your aerobic fitness and how aerobically fit you were taking on that event. So in this specific example, you see here a cycling file. So this is a half Ironman bike split. I believe this one was from Ironman 70.3 Arizona, or Ironman 70.3 Santa Rosa, actually. So this was sometime in like July of 2019. And we see here that this bike split was about 2 hours and 35 minutes. And you see my heart rate, which is the red line, and then you see my power output, which is the pink line. And so obviously with kind of the massive ups and downs in the power, it's kind of hard to look at this, but if we smooth it out, you can see here now the relationship between my heart rate and my power output over the course of the bike ride. So what you're going to notice here is that my heart rate kind of stays relatively constant in like the mid to upper 150s. Okay, it doesn't really change too much actually. So I did a pretty decent job of pacing this bike split actually. And then my power output also doesn't change very much. So this bike course tends to have a lot of like kind of rolling hills. And so there are like a few surges and then a few drops. Like you'll see this is one of the biggest climbs here. And then there's a pretty steep downhill. So I'm kind of not pedaling for a while. So that's where you get some of these little ups and downs and surges in the power. But you'll notice that for the most part, my power remains relatively steady. It maybe drops off ever so slightly towards the very end. But for the most part, you'll even see if you look at like the distance between my heart rate and my power, it doesn't change very much. It stays relatively steady. So there's not a big divergence between my power and my heart rate. So just looking at this, without even looking at a metric, which I'm going to show you next, specific to TrainingPeaks, with just looking at this and just eyeballing the graph, what you're looking at when you're doing aerobic sessions, in order to kind of tell if someone's aerobic fitness is well developed at that specific power output or pace, you just need to look at what their heart rate is doing. So if their power is staying relatively constant, but their heart rate is going up throughout the course of the ride or the run, then that's a sign that their aerobic fitness isn't very well developed at that specific pace or power output. So this is very specific to the pace or power output that you're at. So this, for example, was my 70.3 power output, which I think was like 220 watts. So at my 70.3 race pace or race power, I was efficient enough or durable enough to be able to hold this power output without it becoming significantly more physiologically taxing over the course of the bike ride. So let's just say I never did any work at dialing in my 70.3 race pace power, which I did a lot of work trying to dial this in. I spent a lot of time at my 70.3 race pace trying to dial in 220 watts. If I didn't do any of that work, I might not have been as efficient. And so over the course of this bike ride, I might have ridden at the same power, but it might have been more physiologically taxing as indicated by a heart rate drift. So what we normally see when people get fatigued, even if they're holding the same pace or power output, is that their heart rate starts to drift. And there's really no such thing as like a true steady state, because even if you look at some of the best endurance athletes in the world, if they go out for a 5 or 6 hour bike ride, their heart rate is going to drift slightly over the course of the workout. If it's a really short workout, they might not see much drift, but at a certain point, their heart rate is going to drift. And if you look at like professional triathletes racing 70.3 distance triathlons or even Ironman distance triathlons, and even some of the shorter ones too, you're going to see a drift in their heart rate, and that's because over the course of the race, the same pace or power output that they were holding earlier in the day is going to be more taxing by the end than it was at the very beginning. It's just kind of like physiological nature. But the more you train to become aerobically fit, and especially for like a race specific pace or power output, the more you train to become efficient and aerobically fit at holding that specific pace or power output, the less taxing it becomes over the course of the training session or the race. So in this specific case, you see here that there wasn't that big of a divergence. So I would look at this and say, okay, I was probably aerobically fit enough to hold my 70.3 power for the duration of this bike split, which is about 2 hours and 35 minutes. And now a metric that you can look at that's kind of unique to TrainingPeaks, and I haven't really played around with other kind of training databases like TrainingPeaks, but one specific metric that's very useful to look at when assessing someone's aerobic fitness or aerobic durability is what's known as decoupling. And so it's this metric right here. So you'll see it when you click on like a file. If you click on the analyze file, you'll see here that they give you this power to heart rate metric. And let me clear these other so you can just see the power and the heart rate. So you'll see this decoupling metric. And so normally what TrainingPeaks recommends is that if you can keep this under 5% decoupling, which basically means that, and they take the data from your heart rate and your power, plug it into this fancy algorithm, and then essentially it spits out a percent. But you can think of this percent as like the amount of divergence or decoupling between your heart rate and your power. So the more your heart rate drifts and your power drops, the higher this percentage is going to be. And they normally say that if it's under 5%, then that's typically a sign that that athlete is aerobically fit in that given workout and at that specific power output. So in this specific example, this specific bike split, it's under 5%, and you can see that it's not drifting a lot throughout the workout. My power output is remaining relatively steady. So I would say that I was pretty aerobically fit at holding my 70.3 power output. Now, obviously, it's getting close to 5%, so I could have been a little bit better, and that's probably evidenced by, you see that there's probably a slight separation towards the latter half of the bike split. So in the future, when dialing in my 70.3 race pace, if I were to hold in, or if I were to try and hold 220 watts again, I would probably want to do some more aerobic base building work to like develop my aerobic engine, and then maybe spend some more time again at my 70.3 race pace, maybe even more than I did leading into this particular race, in order to become more aerobically fit and durable at holding my 70.3 power output. Now let's go ahead and look at a run file so that you can see what it looks like on the run. So I showed you an example of a pretty aerobically fit file where you see that their aerobic fitness was pretty good. So now let's look at a file where it's a little bit of a different story. So here we see, I think this is a half marathon run file from another half Ironman that I did. I think this one was Ironman 70.3 Arizona actually. And so you see in this one, now there starts to be a little bit of drift in the heart rate relative to the pace. So on the run, it normally gives you the decoupling metric in terms of pace to heart rate. And so you'll see very clearly with this file, and even if I smooth it out, you'll see it even better. So you'll see my heart rate starts to drift upwards, whereas my pace remains relatively steady, and it drops ever so slightly here at the very end. And so in this specific case, the decoupling percentage is above 5%, so you can see that there's probably a little bit of work to be done in holding my 70.3 race pace, which was I think like around a 740 pace, or 740 minute per mile in this specific race. So this one we see there's a little bit of drift, so you can clearly see the separation. So this would be indicative of the fact that I maybe wasn't quite as aerobically durable or aerobically fit to hold my 70.3 race pace as I maybe could have been. Now, I was able to hold my race pace throughout, even though my heart rate drifted, and so you're normally going to see that anyways. Even in the most aerobically fit individuals, you're going to see some drift over the course of, especially in a race when they're kind of pushing their limits. But if I were to keep this drift from occurring quite so dramatically, would I have been able to not drop off in my pace a little bit the last couple miles like I did here? Probably. Or would I maybe have been able to even like negative split this run and maybe pick it up at the very end, as opposed to trying to fight just to hold steady? That's another possibility. So improving your aerobic fitness and your aerobic durability might have paid off for me in this specific example. I might have been able to go a little bit faster than I did over the course of the race. And now I'll show you a run file from a training session, so not necessarily a race, in which you see that my decoupling was below 5%, which kind of shows good aerobic fitness. So I showed you a couple of race files. So racing is a little bit different than looking at a training file. But again, looking at a race file and looking at that decoupling metric, whether it's pace to heart rate or power to heart rate, can be really useful to tell you if there needs to be work done on that athlete's aerobic engine or their ability to hold low intensity or sub-threshold paces for long periods of time. So what you're normally going to do with this is you're going to look at it from training session to training session. And so this is something that you can look at and compare between different training sessions as well. So it's not something that's necessarily super specific to this specific training session. So I could look at one long run that's an hour and 45 minutes and then look at another long run that's an hour and 45 minutes 2 months later. And if this decoupling metric is improving, then I know that my aerobic fitness is likely improving. Now, there are a lot of kind of environmental and physiological factors that you have to take into account when looking at these metrics, because so many things affect heart rate. And I'm going to touch on those at the end of the video because you have to kind of rule some of those things out before you can get to the point where you're just looking at pace versus heart rate. Because if some of those other physiological factors or environmental factors are inflating someone's heart rate, then you might be looking more at a product of the environment or someone's physiology or nutrition or fueling strategy, as opposed to someone's aerobic fitness or aerobic durability. But in this specific training run, this one was actually a trail run, so I was actually at a pretty slow pace. So I averaged around a 10.5 minute per mile pace. And this was a really easy aerobic run, so I was just trying to keep it very, very easy, very, very steady and aerobic. And so you'll see my heart rate goes up ever so slightly towards the end of the workout, but so does my pace. So I started off relatively slow, and this is actually my power output that you're looking at, because I have a power meter on the run. But if we also look at my pace, and then it's actually about smoothed out as it'll go. If I were to hide my power output, you'll see that my pace also kind of picks up towards the end as well, and I think I just naturally picked up the pace a little bit towards the end. But you'll see that there's not a lot of separation here. So my pace and my heart rate kind of stay coupled together, right? There's not this big divergence. And then if we go back to the power output, you'll see that they also stay together, right? There's not this big divergence. So in this particular run, I demonstrated some pretty good aerobic fitness, or the ability to kind of hold this pace without an increasing physiological cost throughout the duration of this workout. So this is good. This is kind of a sign of good aerobic fitness. Now, some of the things that you need to take into account when you're looking at this decoupling metric and when you're looking at someone's heart rate is you have to consider all of the different factors that affect one's heart rate. So when we're thinking about environmental factors that affect heart rate, we have heat, humidity, dew point, even wind to some extent can affect someone's heart rate if you're running into a headwind versus running with a tailwind. But the big ones are heat and humidity and dew point. So if I were to look at this run, which I think I did in like late September when the morning temperatures were relatively cool outside, so yeah, the temperature here was, I mean, it's warm, but it's not incredibly hot like we normally get here in the Arizona summer. So I'm coming off of a summer where I'm well adapted to the heat, and then running in 80 degrees in the morning feels relatively cool to me. But if it was a lot hotter, like if I was running in the middle of July when it's really humid and hot here in Arizona, I would not have likely seen a decoupling metric of below 5%. So I notice when it's really hot outside especially in the summer, my heart rate tends to drift a little more, even though my pace might stay pretty constant. So you have to take that into account too. So if this person was doing an incredibly hot race or run, and you saw that their heart rate drifted a little bit, some of that might just simply be due to the heat, even though they might be incredibly aerobically fit. So you have to consider the heat and the humidity as well. And then other factors that also affect this are going to be someone's hydration status. So, and then also fueling to some extent. So if their glucose gets really, really low, if their glycogen stores get really, really low, and they start to kind of quote unquote bonk or hit the wall, that can also affect someone's heart rate as well. But hydration status is probably one of the more immediate things that's going to affect someone's heart rate. And this also ties in with heat and humidity as well. So obviously you're going to become dehydrated a lot faster when it's hotter and more humid outside. But as someone dehydrates, you're going to see that their heart rate will start to drift upwards, even if their pace stays the same. So when you're looking at these files, you have to kind of work with the athlete to determine how their fueling was. So if it's a long run like this, if they didn't drink any water whatsoever and it was warm outside and their heart rate drifted, what you saw was maybe more of a sign of their dehydration and less of a sign of their aerobic fitness. Or at least that aerobic fitness that you were trying to look at might be masked by the fact that they just got really dehydrated, and that explained the drift in their heart rate. So if we go back and look at this file, for example, if we pretend this was a training session, let's say this was on a really, really cool day, and then this training session was on a really, really hot day. And let's just say that my pace and everything else was the exact same, but the only difference was the temperature. So we would see here that this might be more of a product of the temperature as opposed to my actual aerobic fitness or my lack thereof. Whereas if I did this one and it was cool outside and they kind of stayed together, then this might be a sign that at this specific temperature and at this pace, I was relatively aerobically fit. So again, a couple things you have to take into account, the big ones being the environmental temperature and the humidity, and then also the hydration status of that person as well when they're fueling and hydrating throughout the course of a workout. So again, the whole purpose of this video is just to talk or to have a little bit of a discussion surrounding ways in which you can kind of assess and measure and look at someone's aerobic fitness or their aerobic durability. Those are kind of the two different terms that I like to use when talking about this. Now, why does this matter? So I've already touched on why aerobic fitness and durability matters to some extent, but for endurance athletes, especially endurance athletes that are doing steady state events, so this is probably slightly less applicable. It is still applicable to athletes that do very like stochastic or like up and down events that have really high bursts in power output or speed and pace with a lot of recovery in between. So think of like crit racing or draft legal style like sprint distance or Olympic distance type racing. This still applies to those athletes as well because they need to have the aerobic fitness to be able to like constantly reproduce high power outputs and surges. But it's probably most relevant and most apparent to steady state endurance athletes that are doing like half marathon, and then like non-drafting triathlon, and especially ultra marathon trail running too. Being very aerobically fit just allows you to maintain your speed, power output, pace for longer without fatiguing. And so if you've ever done an Ironman or even like a half Ironman, and even a marathon to some extent, it's not necessarily the person who can go the fastest who will end up winning or coming out on top or finishing successfully. It's normally those who slow down the least, and this is especially magnified if you look at like Ironman distance racing. If you look at, especially like at the professional level, a lot of the times they're not negative splitting their marathons like some runners might do in a standalone marathon. They're just basically trying to hold the fastest possible power output they can on the bike and then pace on the run without fading. And in order to do that, they need to have a very well developed aerobic engine, and they need to be very aerobically fit and durable to be able to hold a steady state like that for such a long period of time without fatiguing and seeing a drift upwards in their heart rate. And so that was really the whole point of this video, is just to kind of start discussing ways in which you can look at and measure aerobic fitness. Again, you can just look at the relationship between heart rate, power, and pace. But you can also use this metric if you use TrainingPeaks that they provide, and normally you want to see that this is below 5%, and that's normally a sign that they're pretty aerobically fit. Again, it's all very specific to that pace or power output and conditions that they were doing the race or training session in, but this is something that can be compared over time from session to session, as long as you're taking into account other environmental and physiological factors that we talked about. So again, this was just covering ways in which you can start to measure and look at someone's aerobic fitness or aerobic durability. If you have any questions on this, feel free to reach out to me at peakenduranceSolutions@outlook.com. You can also reach me through our website, which is at www.peakenduranceSolutions.com.